was perceived as a language of the poor. Survival, either in a precarious existence at home, dealing with law or eviction, or as a migrant in America, demanded a new language to enter the society to which one had migrated. That language was the state language English, the vernacular required for law, for school, for church, for immigration, and the letter that was precious from the immigrant who had gone on ahead. Later Irish people would take that adopted language, adapt it, stretch it for ironies, and make something entirely new of it, and as a final flourish, use its new form to invoke both ancient versions of independence and new forms of republican existence. And in this they would be assisted again and again by Irish Americans. I am struck, and I was preparing some other lectures, I will give one in Boston, by, for example, the attitude of the Irish Times, or the London Times at the time of the famine in 1847, almost suggesting that the principles of economic laissez-faire must be respected and the Irish left to suffer. And then many decades later, maybe 2 decades later, it writes an editorial to say, "We have made a terrible mistake. Millions of them have gone to a new land of hope, a land that will become rich and expand, and they will keep on telling the story of misrule for 700 years. We are now at a time which needs new myth-making, including a myth for our Irishness. And I believe that this involves both the ethics of memory and the courage of imagination. What should we remember, and how? What should we never forget? How might we come to know and imagine, dare to hope and offer such an Irishness for new times as would be authentic and sustainable? I can think of no better starting point for a discussion on how Ireland might be remembered and imagined than with consideration of Thomas Flanagan and his work. Thomas Flanagan almost defies all attempts at categorization. He was a great American writer who wrote a trilogy of great Irish novels, the grandson of Irish immigrants to the United States, who by his own account, he's described himself as only pale green to the point of translucency as a young man, and yet who devoted much of his life and writing to recovering the Irish historical experience through his fiction. And then as a literary critic, he was balanced, wise, and understated. He was as much at home discussing Yeats and Joyce as he was discussing Ernest Hemingway and William Kennedy. A great rescuer, he recovered from neglect and restored the work and reputations of Maria Edgeworth, Lady Morgan, and William Carleton. Most of all, Tom Flanagan was the teacher who warned against any simplification of Irishness. My Irish-American identity, he said, is typical only in the sense that there is no such typical experience. Identity, he added, is a personal matter, complex, slanted, convoluted. In papers later this week, I will show that this homogeneity is probably the greatest error in attempting to understand Irish history in the recent past or before. No more than, I believe myself, it was a great distracting error in relation to understanding the social structure of Ireland in our period, and to some extent misleads the work of Conrad Arnsberg and Saul Campbell. But what better starting point then for a reconsideration of Irish identity in all its complexity, as he called it, its slantedness and convolution. If identity is always complex, the issue for immigrants and the choices required of them are even more so. For many, it was easier to put on and wear the mask expected of them than to shape a new identity at once. Shaping a new identity took time and was itself fraught. Thomas Flanagan notes that the experience of many immigrant communities was a ghetto experience for the first 2 generations, and that this was often succeeded by a self-ghettoization or withholding from a mainstream and official culture seen as unwelcoming or elitist. But we have to be careful about this use of masks, because it may be not something letter. It may be something very complicated, as James C. Scott and others have pointed out, the way a strategy of defense. William Kennedy has painstakingly recorded a lost and wholly Irish-American world where, as Tom Flanagan shrewdly observes, Protestants rarely glimpsed her like unicorns, comely and delicate of bone. Here Irish-Americans felt themselves caught in a double bind, entered the establishment culture, and they cut off their roots on the source of much of their vitality, refrained from doing so, and they remained a cultural province. But at the same time as they were refashioning the societies they had entered, Irish immigrant communities were also redefining and refashioning what it meant to be Irish, feeding the sources of emergent nationalism. The impact of the Irish immigrant experience in Ireland itself was creative, profound and lasting. Modern Ireland was constructed as much in Edinburgh and New York as in Galway or Dublin. Though the immigrant masque at its point of destination may have been seen as conservative and sometimes backward-looking, in reality the Irish proved to be great modernizers, many having chosen, as I have said, to learn English in Ireland. Some did this so as to prepare their children to survive and succeed, perhaps overseas, or in an Ireland where English was the key to both defence and literacy. The value that they set on education in their new land can be traced in bricks and mortar in countless high schools in all of New York's boroughs and in the colleges of Fordham, St. John's, Manhattan. By the 1890s at home, the Irish language was spoken in Ireland as a main language by less than 5% of children under 10. In the categories above the age of 10, it was higher, of course, but the proof was that the language was beginning to fade as a taught language. And I say that to pay tribute to the effort of Douglas the Heather, Céadú Thrón Héireann, the first president of Ireland, who was heroic in seeing the paths in which the language was. Indeed, it's very interesting about the scholarship with which he carried out his campaign against Mahaffey and Atkinson, for example, who in 1912, in the Commission on Secondary Education, suggested that there was nothing in the Irish language worthy of teaching. And Douglas the Heather assembled some of the foremost scholarship of Europe to make a submission and defeated on grounds of fact and linguistic scholarship the suggestions that had been made. For older children at this time, and adults, the proportion, as I've said, may have been higher, but there is no doubt that the Irish language was in decline, and as I have said, and I pay tribute to my predecessor, the great task of saving the language was undertaken by the Gaelic League, led by Douglas the Heather. Yet it was in English that English became the language of Irish separatism. Gradually, writers took control of our own story through journalism and creative writing. Stephen Dedalus' determination to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race was shared in a different medium by journalists such as John Boyle O'Reilly, John Devine, Finlay Peter Dunn. Emigration too taught the Irish a further skill, the ability to maintain poise in the face of change, to live in two or even more worlds at once, to adapt and to broker. This is the migratory experience. The marginalization of consciousness, it is caught in literature, but so often, sadly, missed in the social sciences. To be an American conscious of his Irish identity, Thomas Flanagan once wrote, is to exist within complexities, paradoxes, contraries, ambiguities, ironies, and perhaps a few pitfalls. The use of memory, then, as both succor and dagger, as I have said, is at the heart of some of the finest writing in Irish America. Eugene O'Neill mined his family's immigrant experience and in the process revolutionized American theatre. "The thing that explains more than anything about me," he once told his son, "is the fact that I'm Irish." It is 100 years since the first Abbey Theatre performances in New York. Those performances transfixed O'Neill, then a 23-year-old part-time sailor living in a boarding house and coming to terms with a failing marriage. So a theatre company that had revolutionized Irish theatre at home exerted a profound influence on a writer who revolutionized in turn American theatre. Great things indeed. To think of innovation in the cultural sense, for example, James Joyce, the innovator who revolutionized the English language from within. But innovation is a characteristic of Irish history across all endeavours. John Scottus Arugina stands unique among Western thinkers of the early Middle Ages in the linguistic ability and intellectual daring that enabled him to synthesize strands of thought from West and East into a coherent system of thought that is probably without comparison in the 7 centuries between Augustine and Aquinas. We are correctly proud of Shaw, Yeats, Beckett and Healy when Nobel laureates in literature are mentioned. When Irish Nobel laureates are enumerated, Ernest Walton, born in Dungarvan, and joint developer of the first particle accelerator that split the atom in 1931, is often overlooked. Perhaps that is because it is easier to appreciate a poem by Yeats than to consider the disintegration of lithium. But William Rowan Hamilton in mathematics, Robert Boyle in chemistry, astronomer Agnes Mary Clark, and John Tyndall in light physics are part of the Irish mind, as are so many Irish scientists, technologists and innovators, so many of whom teach, research and work in the United States. So creativity can have many manifestations, a poem or a painting, but also a new economics, a new business model, medical treatment, or nanoplastic composite. But I want to return briefly to an example, both principled and pragmatic precedent, of the role that memory plays in imagination and renewal. I want to return to that snowy January night in Boston in 1897, when some 50 men gathered to found the American Irish Historical Society. Their purpose was to challenge the monolithic view of American history that diminished the role played by immigrant groups in favor of an Anglo-centric narrative. They included Catholic and Protestant, some born in Ireland, others from families long established in this country. Henry Stoddard Ruggles claimed descent from an Irishman who had come to America in 1657. Theodore Roosevelt, who became President of the United States 4 years later, claimed descent from the Barnwell family associated with Drimna Castle in Dublin. Augustine St. Gaudens, the great American sculptor and creator of the Parnell Monument in O'Connell Street, was born in Dublin to a French father and an Irish mother. John Boyle O'Reilly, born in Doubt, County Meath, had been a trooper in the 10th Hussars before he was a Fenian convict, fierce patriot, and later newspaper editor. John Devoy, who Thomas Flanagan has described as that fierce and splendid old Fenian rebel. They were all there. The AIHS, founded by these great supporters of Irishness, at home and abroad, was as much about the future of America as about the history of the Irish in America. And like Pearse and Joyce in the decades that followed, its founders were exercising choice over what was remembered, what was retrieved from the brutal ending of history, mining the immigrant experience to replenish this country, while also contributing to the construction of an emerging Irish identity. Their intent was to create a United States that valued and welcomed diversity, and that's its strongest legacy, and that built its narrative on genuine historical integrity, on what Tom Flanagan described as the enriching actualities of the American cultural experience. They initiated all this, their work, in the same year that Yeats and Lady Gregory began the partnership which led to the foundation of the Irish National Theatre 2 years later. The foundation of this society was no isolated phenomenon, but part of a wider appreciation that something very precious was disappearing and would soon be irretrievable. It was also part of a process aimed at bringing the immigrant experience in its fullness into the mainstream of American memory, not just Irish immigrant experience. In another area, in a different city, a valuable act of cultural retrieval was underway. By the time of the founders of the American Irish Historical Society had come together in Boston, an Irish-born Chicago police officer, Francis O'Neill, had set about retrieving a different wealth, recording the work of some of the innumerable traditional Irish musicians who had immigrated to that city, but whose repertoire was fast disappearing. Now, music may be the most portable of art forms, while depending for its survival on an appreciative audience, and among immigrant communities that audience for the music in its arrival form diminishes as new generations busy themselves with the task of integrating. But then the permeability of music to other forms of composition and performance also means, and it happened in the Irish case, that it comes back home unenriched. The link between music and place also renders it fragile when displaced. Evan Boland, herself no stranger to displacement, has described how song, sea, weather, and home become one in the singers of the west of Ireland, of whom she wrote, "Every night their mouths filled with Atlantic storms and clouded over stars and exhausted birds." So we should all be grateful to Francis O'Neill for initiating one of the greatest works of cultural retrieval, saving for posterity countless melodies that would otherwise have been lost. We should remember too that the famine immigrants to Boston brought valuable fragments in their bundles of possession, manuscripts in Irish, copied and shared, such as those by Padraig Ferriter, some of which are now in the Athenaeum in Boston. What was retrieved by O'Neill and others is probably only a small fraction of what was lost in the decades following the famine, when New York resonated to the sound of Irish, both spoken and sung. Graffiti in Irish, etched in plaster on a wall what is now the South Street Seaport Museum in Lower Manhattan, is one of the few physical remains of a chapter in the history of Ireland and New York, now largely lost in time. And there is much that has been lost in the words of an oral tradition, even if more of the music has survived. Evan Boland again, I quote her, she speculates that Atlantis is less a place than a metaphor for what is lost irretrievable. She writes, "Maybe what really happened is this. The old fable makers searched hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever and never found it. And so, in the best traditions of where we come from, they gave their sorrow a name and drowned it." This preoccupation with memory and retrieval is common to many Irish American writers, many beyond Eugene O'Neill too. William Kennedy's painstaking reconstruction of Albany in the late 19th and early 20th century is comparable in its own way to Joyce's reconstruction of his Dublin on a Day. But the traces of lost lives go back far beyond the famine and can be located in the most unexpected places and recovered in the most surprising ways. Perhaps a serendipitous finding might illustrate. Deep in the Rappahannock Valley in the tidewaters of Virginia, a cabinet maker in the 18th century used a distinctive design known as the Triffid foot. It is virtually unknown in Virginia, outside the Rappahannock Valley, and unknown in England, but is a common form in Irish furniture. It is the signature, only recently identified, of an Irish craftsman who arrived in the valley sometime in the 1760s or 70s. It is a reminder that the Irish immigrant experience is rich and various. 50 years before the famine, New York's most vigorous trading community, hailed from the northern counties of Ireland, and occupied itself largely with the trade in flaxseed from the Hudson Valley. That immigration wave, which my colleague Gerard de Tuig has called prudent and Protestant. I want to, however, this evening invoke the act of remembering not just as an act of retrieval, but as a forward-looking act, as an exercise of will and conscious choice, an essential part of the process of renewal, a recovery of such words of ethical life as might reveal an illumination of the unrealized possibility of future Irishness, what I have called in my inaugural address the féidirtí gan teorann. Such a creative impulse as we need now, not only for economic recovery, but for humanity, is one that will relocate economics, for example, in culture, in a moral ethical context that is scholarly, reflexive, and genuinely emancipatory, and economics within a culture. The impulse that drove Finian to a rock 8 miles from the coast of Kerry, and Columbanus to what is today France and Italy 1500 years ago, required a vision of the future, a vision that laid strong cultural foundations across Europe. That same impulse in 1632 that drove Micheál Mac Cláraic and his collaborators to collect and transcribe manuscripts from the disappearing bardic culture. That was done with an eye to the future, and it made possible the imaginative reinvention of Ireland in succeeding centuries. The Gaelic revival in Gluaiseachta Bheochanna was likewise concerned more with what Ireland might be rather than what it once had been. So if we wish then to pass from failed paradigms of economic theory and the connection between economics and society, and embark on the new and necessary reflections and policies that will serve not only us but others in an emancipatory way, we must realize that an amnesia as to what Irishness was, at home or abroad, would not serve us very well. Rather, we might make an amnesty that is necessary at times so as to allow for flexibility in our narratives, and such a pluralism as will allow for the narratives of others to enter into our discourse, and above all allow both to change, and where appropriate, pardon to be made and accepted. And one clear thread connects then the foundation of the American Irish Historical Society, the work of Tom Flanagan, and our circumstances today. The American Irish Historical Society came into being as Irish around the world, as the world began to prepare for the centenary of 1798. Some of the glories in your own archives that you have referred to relate to the United Irishmen, to Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone. That centenary, it has often been remarked, had more to do with Ireland in 1898 than in 1798. The celebrations marked a turning point in the political campaign for self-determination after what had been a decade of relative inactivity in politics. The Irish Parliamentary Party used it to build momentum towards Home Rule, overlooking the ambiguity inherent in what had been a bloody and popular uprising. The Church recalled it as the struggle of a Catholic people for religious belief, and took a muted approach to the strong strain of secular republicanism in the rising. The century too would see a new chapter written on the theme of land. Native grazier predators would use the mask of religion and nationalism to defeat the land-hungry aspirations of what was left of the cottiers, the non-inheriting sons. The agricultural labourers were gone, having borne the greatest burden of the famine and the immigration that followed it. At home we paid a high price for these immigrations. 80 years later, Thomas Flanagan again retrieved this episode in Irish history for a wider audience. Writing at the height of the Troubles, the episode he chose was not the rebellion in Ulster or in Leinster, which he felt were too burdened with a kind of sentimental nationalist cult, but the less well-known uprising in Mayo. Now we are again on the threshold of the centenaries of events that shaped Ireland for much of the past 100 years. Recent weeks have seen the centenaries begin of the first Unionist rally against Home Rule, the introduction of the third Home Rule Bill into Parliament, the sinking of the Titanic. This year too we will celebrate the foundation of the Labour Party in 1912, of which in previous life I was president. We also will in coming years mark the birth of we will celebrate the great lockout of 1913, about whom George Bernard Shaw wrote what I believe myself was one of the finest essays. The start of the First World War and the events that led to the Easter Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War, in which my own family were on different sides. My father on the Republican side, my uncles on the Free State side. These anniversaries are also an opportunity to reflect on the American dimension of Irishness, to consider the close connections between the labour movements in both countries, links that brought James Connolly to New Jersey and New York as a labour organiser, that brought Jim Larkin to Butte, Montana to address some of the contradictions of class and ethnicity and of solidarity and complicity. I need more time and another day to go into the detail of that particular one. The anniversaries are an opportunity too to retrieve a sense of peace with our complex identities. It seems to me that as the 20th century progressed, we became less comfortable with our complex identities. The polarizing events of 100 years ago had the effect of fixing and freezing national and religious identities for the decades that followed, in a way that was exclusive and confrontational, narrowing our horizons. So it is the recovery of and respect for complexity that will set us free. The sense of Irishness drawn from complex sources and experienced in complex circumstances as a common identity across national boundaries could also benefit from renewal. We have too often fallen into the trap of uncritically allowing shallow difference to define us. That cannot change fast enough, in my view. The Irishness that I believe is now emerging, but the possibilities of which have not yet been fully realized, is one that will be informed by the experience of the Irish abroad as much or even to a greater extent than it will be informed by those of us who live in Ireland. And above all else, it will be informed, I hope, by the richness of transience and the migratory experience so missing from the social sciences. Distance grants perspective, and it is not accidental that so many of our contemporary most perceptive scholars choose the lens of temporary exile, and are people of Ireland at once living at home and abroad. It is an Irishness that will be assessed too in a global context, and I believe that its ethical content will be one of the measures by which it will be tested. It is an ethical content that has to be forged, drawing on the well of memory, from the richest depths of such periods as the 7th century, when for the good not only of the oldest and widest conception of Europe, but for all humanity, and the beauty and wonder of scholarship, those Irish scholars such as Columbanus set out across Europe from Ireland to Bobbio in Italy. It is not only from memory that the Irishness of a new departure will come, however, but from what is imagined as possibility and capable of being brought to fruition in Ernst Becker's sense. This, I repeat, will not be a new task for Irish people. Ireland, again I say, is not a society that simply moved out of tradition into modernity. As scholars such as Declan Kybert have pointed out, Irish people have again and again been required to modernize, to adapt, to learn, create, and come through with such creativity as was necessary so as to define and deal with that which was initially strange. Learning a new language of the state, arriving in a new society and culture, negotiating all the requirements of the migrant's life, facing the new, that all required a flexibility of mind that today's Irish people still possess. And it is a possession enhanced by our people today by high levels of education, higher than most cohorts of the same age in any European country. And that is why I believe that the new Irishness built on an ethical base full of creativity, will usher in a new and exciting period in Irish history, a period of authenticity built on a legacy of intellectual achievement and drawing on all our Irish capacities of imagination, innovation and creativity, an Irishness of which we can, all Irish at home and abroad, can indeed be proud. Derek Mahon, Tom Flanagan's close friend in New York, has recently written about the need to renew values in an Ireland that has seen excess. And poets, as usual, do it in a distilled way. He wrote, "It's time now to go back at last, beyond irony and slick depreciation, past hedge and fencing to a clearer vision, time to create a future from the past." We are at such a point of renewal. It is a great challenge, renewing Ireland and also renewing the sense of what it means to be Irish after the events of recent years. Those outside Ireland who share a sense of Irishness are vital to that process. And as Uachtar O'Naheran, President of Ireland, I look forward to working with them in forging our new Irishness. That process of renewal, to which I invite all of us Irish, is now one to which we must give our best efforts at home and abroad. That, after all, is simply consistent with the spirit of our Constitution, acknowledging Ireland's, I quote, special affinity with people of Irish ancestry living abroad who share its cultural identity and heritage. Just as the founders of this society helped bring the Irish immigrant experience into the American mainstream, I hope that we, working together, can bring the wider global Irish experience, its ideas and innovative talent, back into the Irish mainstream. And Global Irish Network, which has given new momentum to the gathering, for example, it was given to the Global Irish Economic Forum at Dublin Castle last October, is one element in that process. The Certificate of Irish Heritage offers a formal recognition of Irishness that extends beyond the first two generations currently entitled to Irish citizenship. And this year we'll see the first awards of a new Presidential Distinguished Service Award for the Irish abroad. Small but important steps in a new attentiveness to the vital contribution that all those who belong to the Irish family can make to the process of renewal. To return and to finish, mar focal square, agus kan creek coalition made at our ram as a reach, fish mar privilege and lake show huert in honor Thomas Flanagan. Memory abounds in Seamus Heaney's poem, Night Peace for Tom Flanagan. In it, Seamus conjures the shades of Wolfe Tone, Maria Edgeworth, John Mitchell, George Moore and William Carleton. Then blinking into daylight on the steps of his house, overlooking Sandymount Strand, as more figures from the ever-present past pause to pay tribute to the writer Thomas Flanagan, who honoured and attended to our past, Seamus wrote, "Think of one out walking there with his ash plant, headed for Nighttown to the tower by Sandymount. Our genius loci, fount of inwit, our conscience forger lifts his hat and tips you an old world salute as if to say, yes, yes, to you and all you write, your mastery. And now a bat flits from the trees to grow a foam I recognize, the silent flap of WB's great soul in flight. His circles thrice to greet you flies into the night." It was George Steiner who wrote that without the true fiction of history, without the unbroken animation of a chosen path, we become flat shadows. Thomas Flanagan gave us not flat shadows, but the true fiction of history. He did so with an eye fixed firmly on the present and the future. In the last lines of his greatest novel, memory and imagination are harnessed to present purpose, and I am delighted to let him, Thomas Flanagan, have the last word. It is in the brightness of the morning air, as the poet tells us, that hope and memory walk towards us across meadows, radiant as a girl in her first beauty. When we hold to our ears the convoluted shell of the past, what we hear are our own voices, but the voices have been instructed by all that we know about the past, all the contradictory things that we feel about it, all that we have imagined about it. Those voices make possible for us imaginary selves, imaginary opposites, imaginary others. Gur míle maith agus Dr. Vaija, agus an éisteach a thug sibh liom, Many thanks and take care.